Welcome back, everyone, to the Charismatic Voice. Today's interview is going to be a bit different from the other interviews in the series because I am the person being interviewed, and I've invited my esteemed colleague, friend, fellow YouTuber, did I mention she has an awesome channel, and also fellow vocal nerd, Julia Nilon, to do the great service of interviewing me, which is so weird. Julia, thank you so much.
No, I am absolutely delighted to be here interviewing you today and super excited to dive on into what I'm sure is going to be a super fun conversation. Lots of vocal nerdery, lots of background, lots of chit chat about your industry as well, which I'm sure is going to be super interesting for so many people who perhaps aren't as familiar with the classical world. And then, of course, your trajectory through your career that's wound up with you on YouTube, sharing your knowledge and experience with the world. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be here today, giving you your interview for this podcast.
Right, so many of the same questions. Figured, okay, it's time that I redirected them so that, especially since the podcast is starting, people can know who I am if they haven't been in the YouTube space first. But then within YouTube, people have asked about me and said, well, where can I, how about you answer these questions? So I think it's like doubly fun.
Absolutely. And now I do have a very special question that I'm sure you kick off all of your interviews with. Very important. Choose your answer wisely. Tea or coffee?
Most definitely tea.
Yes.
And today I have a green honey bush, essentially, that we've got going on. I can't have any caffeine because I'm pregnant. 7.5 months. So I've been really diving into a lot of herbal and decaf teas. And they are not as satisfying as some of the other ones often, but the green honey bush is. It's quite good.
Well,
what about you?
I'm glad you managed to find something that you can find satisfying while you're no longer caffeinated. So this morning, I kind of went the comedy route. I am drinking a white ginger tea.
How appropriate.
Yeah, it's very soothing. It's got a bit of a kick to it at the same time, though, somehow.
And is that going to be, you're going to have a little bit of white tea in there, so you got some caffeine, right?
Yeah, so white tea actually has a surprising amount of caffeine in it, but I think it feels differently in the body. You know how you drink different kinds of caffeine and your body processes it differently? Well, This is my version of something that's a little more relaxing in the morning that is really easy to drink and just doesn't make you crazy with caffeine.
Right. I know L-theanine is something at one point I remember taking to help me calm my nerves before performances. And it's one of those things that's in tea. I think it's in green tea more than black tea. And I want to say it might be in white tea more. And it helps like level out that caffeine high, essentially. That might be it, but it might not.
Well, that certainly sounds like something that I've heard to do with green tea, particularly with people who switch from coffee to matcha, which is that of course, you know what matcha is, the ground down green tea leaves that winds up into that like electric green powder. And then people drink it and it's a good alternative to coffee and the body processes the caffeine differently. So yeah, I believe it. You've told me it, so I believe it.
Don't take our words totally for that. You can take our words and other things, but that one is a probably. Wink, wink.
Yeah. Probably we can put that one in quotations. All right. So I'm here with you, Elizabeth. I've got a question here on how it is that you actually pronounce your name fully, because who knows, maybe my accent will absolutely butcher your last name. I think I know how it's pronounced, but why don't you, for your wonderful viewers and listeners, help us break down your full name?
Right. And I feel like this is so important with artists, especially with the international channels that we have these days. Names are difficult to say sometimes, and mine is a little difficult for a lot of people. So last name, it starts with a Z, and then it goes to an H. And most people say Zharoff, or they'll end up putting the H in a weird space, and they'll say Zharoff. But those two together make a J sound, like the French J, essentially. So it's Zharoff. So Elizabeth Zharoff.
Cool. Well, that's really, really good to know. And My next question, I suppose, and this is pretty common with performers, is this a stage name? Is this your real name? Like, I mean, you don't have to say your real name on camera if you don't want to, but it can be fun to know that something is actually a stage name or something you've borrowed from somewhere. So is Zharoff your last name? Or
Zharoff
a stage name?
is actually my like an artist name or stage name. And it's funny because I've had 3 names in life. So my personal name at this point is Elizabeth McCune because I married a certain wonderful Kirk McCune a couple years ago and took his name. But I had already, become known as a singer and was starting to become known as a YouTuber at that point underneath Zharoff. But Zharoff wasn't even my original name. My original name was Ford. Which is like, whoa, Elizabeth Ford, very presidential. So I got married. I had an early marriage, very, very young. We split ways very quickly. But during that time, I had started to sing and become known in some bigger competitions. And because once that ball is rolling, you really don't want to reduce the steam on it. I kept the name Zharoff, and it really also is a very unique name for a lot of singing purposes. Nobody else had it, and it ended up working very well as an artist name. And today it still feels like my artist persona, if you will.
Well, I mean, that's great that you managed to have something that managed to take off within a span of 2 years, because that's really not a long time in performance in the performance world. So that's incredible. Yeah. And I definitely understand wanting to stick with it. Like once you have something that people remember that stick in their head, changing it can sometimes be counterproductive to your continued trajectory throughout your career. Speaking of careers, you are a professional opera singer and one who has been able to sing all over the world. But how do we get to that place? How do we go from a farm to being a professional opera singer performing internationally? How do we get there?
I think that it's one of the more curious trajectories for sure. So I grew up on an orchard in the middle of Washington State. And, we had apples and cherries and apricots and really, truly farm girl all the way. And then I drove the tractor, and my dad at one point, I remember him saying, if you could hear me before the tractor, that maybe someday I'd have a career. So I practiced singing very loudly on the tractor while driving around a lake, and they really could hear me first. That was good. But ultimately, my mom taught me music from very, very young. And I fell in love with music, before I could do anything. My older siblings were already playing piano or various instruments or singing. And so I was really immersed in that culture already. And my extended family also did a lot of music. My grandfather was a Southern Baptist minister, and he sang in this quartet called the Living Waters Quartet along with my uncle. And so I was hearing essentially barbershop quartet and really, really incredible voices. Like they had amazing, amazing voices singing and like bringing down the church with like just amazing music from a very young age. And as a result, I was in it. And my mom was taking me to, it was like a Bach festival every summer as well. And at that Bach festival, I really fell in love with classical music in particular. It's the Lake Chelan Bach Festival. So when I was going there, I was hearing string quartets. I was also watching all of the performances of pianists, singers. I sang in the choir at a very young age, was just in love with the soloists singing there. And I got this education in sort of music that was very elegant and classy without necessarily being in a place where you would expect for that to happen.
I was about to say, that sounds like incredible audiation from such a young age, and that can be so critical for, I guess, the foundation and the building blocks of being a musician is having that exposure. But the kind of exposure that you're describing there is something that I certainly wouldn't be expecting from someone who's saying that they're in the middle of like growing up on an orchard. Like that's right? That's really amazing. And the exposure to classical music is already something that I think is fairly unique because it's been a while. It's been a while since classical music would be deemed the popular style of the era.
Right?
So that is absolutely incredible that you had access to not only people within your family who were highly musical and seemed to be quite invested in cultivating that love of music, but that you had external places that could influence and foster that love. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow.
And my mom would take me with her to her lessons at one point when I was homeschooled. So I'd watch her teaching piano, and I would go with her to things like adjudications or piano competitions as well, and watch everybody else perform. So I was just watching and absorbing it. And then when I got a little bit older, she actually would drive me 2 hours down to this college town called Ellensburg. And I studied with her college piano teacher there at one point. And then I studied with another wonderful voice teacher named Leslie McEwen, so that they could sort of continue to build off of the skills that she'd originally built that basis for. And ultimately, it was, the combination of her working with me on the piano and being able to sing with her all the time was just beautiful, and such a wonderful way to grow together. She was always encouraging me to do things like sing in a trio. I was very, very supportive. Just amazing.
Yes, that is absolutely amazing. So you've had lots of exposure as a child to this kind of music. That love of classical has been fostered through your family and your experiences. I'm sure that exposure to the barbershop quartet arrangements will pop up later when we start to talk about the incredible love that you have for a cappella and arranging for voice. I'm sure we can talk about that later. But past singing lessons, if we continue along that, timeline of you getting to performing internationally as a professional opera singer, what comes next in our timeline if we continued our lessons throughout school and driving and working with people who could push and nurture your voice? What happens after school? How do we wind up being Elizabeth Zharoff, professional opera singer?
That's good. I think there was a particular moment when I decided that I was going to pursue singing. And it was actually my senior year. It was with my mom at a voice competition. And I thought I was going to be a classical pianist at first. So I actually had gone ahead to the state level in both piano and voice this year. And ended up winning the whole state in voice, which was a big deal at the time.
Amazing.
Right. Singing. I know.
Well done.
Yeah. And I was singing this song called Nuvoletta by Samuel Barber. At the end, I remember this feeling of time slowing down on stage. I now think that that's probably adrenaline and heartbeat related, but it also just feels magical, right? And the time seemed to slow down, and my mom was playing the piano beautifully on this piece. I saw people in the audience in this competition lean in as I sang about this girl essentially jumping off a balcony and kind of floating away. And there's this beautiful crescendo, decrescendo that happens at the end. And it was like that moment where I realized I connected to people in a very strong and powerful way. I felt their emotions very much intertwined with mine. There was a sort of power in this that I'd never seen before. And I knew that I had to pursue voice from that moment. The way to get there was eventually I went as an exchange student the first year after high school to France. And I was just planning, most students with the Rotary Exchange program just go into high school at that point. But I was very deliberate about saying, no, I'm going to pursue music at a high level. And so I entered the conservatory there as a voice student. I auditioned kind of in a later round of students, and they were like, yeah, no, you got this. And that really began my formal education at the college level. I just sing tons of French repertoire and lots of French Coloratura opera. Sing about birds a lot in French. So that's where it starts. I think a lot of times in order to get to opera from just a sort of classical education, you have to start going into languages and the culture and psychology and acting that comes along with opera.
Yeah. I definitely think that as far as opera is concerned, there are a few people that perhaps think that all classical singing is opera, but opera is actually, it's this specialized performance style as well. So there's all those other things that you have to be able to do in order to be an opera singer. And one of those, of course, is the stamina to hold a role for however many hours the opera is going for.
Right?
So
Yes.
when it comes to developing those skills to be able to prepare yourself for that kind of enduring environment where there's a lot kind of riding on your acting skills, but also on your body and your mental state of being where you are in that moment. What did you do for training to be an opera singer? So we've had our classical singing, we've had our classical training. Now we're diving on into languages and being submerged in a different culture. I know that for Europe, the classical world can hold a lot more meaning and significance compared to other places in the world because it's a little bit more widespread. There's a little bit more support. And almost like they cherish the classical music to another degree. And of course, it's going to be different depending on where you are. But how do you prepare? What does an opera singer do? What does your training look like to be able to handle those kinds of performance environments?
Yeah. I think that one of the main steady things across the board while I was training in opera and still train today is you just practice a lot. You need to, especially for the amount of volume and stamina that's involved, you need to practice a lot. You spend a lot of time in a practice room, and you also spend a lot of time not just practicing fully singing, but also a lot of time practicing quietly because you don't want to wear your vocal folds out. It's sort of a similar process to athletes, right? You're using your body. So I think it's important to train your body and your mind at the same time. For example, at one point, studying a Czech opera, I ended up doing The Cunning Little Vixen at one point while I was at Curtis, and that's all in Czech. 2 hours of memorizing Czech when it's not a language you speak is really, really tough. We had lots of coaches. I knew all of the words and all of the meaning and all of the pronunciation, but memorizing that is so hard. I would fall asleep on my score all the time. So sometimes that practice is just trying to memorize languages. But it is essential in any operatic preparation program that you have tons of language preparation, which served me very well in other ways later on, in sort of fascinating ways. But ultimately, you need to study the big 4 languages, which are French, German, Italian, and English. And when you first enter school, you often will go through studying your own language first, so English, and looking at how it's pronounced with IPA, which is International Phonetic Alphabet. Julie's like, yes, I know this. I know you know it.
This is great. So the International Phonetic Alphabet, for anyone who isn't familiar with having to look at IPA, it's if you were to look at a symbol that represents the accurate phonetic pronunciation of certain sounds, those symbols make up the structure of words, and it can make it a lot easier for you if you're learning foreign language to be able to read IPA, because then you look at a symbol and you know what that pronunciation sounds like. So sometimes, and especially in English, we're not phonetically consistent. We have to learn how to read the word and then speak the word. So IPA helps us get around that. It's like another alphabet, an alphabet of sounds, if you will, so that we can accurately pronounce things in foreign language. And I'm sure that for you, Elizabeth, that time spent on IPA sped things up in the process of having to sing in so many different foreign languages.
Yes. And your description of IPA was brilliant. It was like, oh, wow, an alphabet of sounds. Oh, I want to use that in the future. That's so good. Yeah. IPA I think is crucial for opera singers to learn. And that's part of the study. And then you, of course, are singing tons of songs in different languages. And specifically, if you're going to go the direction of opera, you also end up doing a lot of acting classes, a lot of movement classes. You start to get more into the psychology of things. And you start doing operas in college. You start doing various roles to dip your toes in. It's a little bit scary.
Yes, absolutely. And just one last question on the topic of languages, because I'm curious. Is there any particular performance language that particularly kicked your butt when you started learning it?
Oh man, there's sort of two ways I could go with this. Oh man, there's actually several. I'm just going to talk about them all. Okay. So
Yes, okay, go.
at one point I spent a semester in China. I'll talk about all the schools.
Yeah.
I'm going to go through the schools really quickly because it gets
Let's
confusing.
go through schools and associated languages.
Yeah, right. Okay, so French, I did a French conservatory, was very fluent in French by the end of a year and in France, staying with families through the Rotary Exchange Program. So did that. Went to Pacific Lutheran University, then back in Washington State. Great school for music in Washington, but I had a professor say, if you're really going to pursue opera more seriously, you might want to get somewhere where you can have access to more auditions, competitions, and just seeing opera regularly. So he helped me decide to do a transfer. But before I had decided that, it was already time for the next year. So we decided that I would once again go to another country. I went to China for a semester because it sounded really cool. And like, I'd probably be in Europe if I did opera. So I thought, well, I want to go somewhere else. And so I went to China and studied a conservatory in Sichuan province in Chengdu, which was really cool.
Yeah.
And then ended up transferring to Oberlin Conservatory in Ohio, but it has lots and lots of access to the big young artist development programs, competitions, et cetera, et cetera. So I went there, got my bachelor's degree from there. Then I went to my dream school, Curtis Institute of Music. I love that school so much. And spent 3 years there, got my master's degree from there. And then eventually from there went over to Germany and was in a kind of hybrid performance with some educational elements as well, learning German in Dresden and singing with the opera house there. So,
okay. So
okay.
that's a lot of places to have to navigate, not just repertoire, but also socially, especially going to somewhere like China where the language can be a bit of a barrier, just existing socially within that space. That's incredible that you would go there and study. Question while you were there, because there's a pretty big distinction between Western classical opera and Chinese opera. Did you dive into any of the Chinese opera stuff while you were there?
I did a little bit, and I decided that I didn't necessarily want to pursue that training for my own voice, but I did go and watch a bunch of it and was like, whoa, what is this? Whoa, I don't know how much I like this, but I like it, but I feel confused by it at times. It's so specialized, very much in the way that Western opera is specialized, actually, but it's very, very different. I did sing a bunch of Chinese art songs while I was there.
Beautiful.
And those, I would point to those as being some of the most difficult to memorize. With Chinese, with the characters, I feel that it's really easy for the pronunciation of the word to just float out of your head. It's just gone. So I would write down all kinds of notes for how to pronounce it, but I didn't know IPA yet at that point. Okay. And digesting the correct pronunciation for Chinese and how things were just slightly different, it was very difficult to memorize without a little more structure around it. But they don't use as much tones when you're singing a classical song in Chinese. So luckily I didn't have to worry about that part as much. Right? Yes. Other than Czech being really difficult, because there are things where you're singing through a consonant, like right? You have to sing through these crazy consonants.
Wow. That's fricative singing.
Yes, exactly. Just like, what's happening? That's a really hard language to sing in. But the language that kicked my butt the most was surprisingly, I would say, French, but for a very specific reason. I had gone to France. I'd studied in a French conservatory. I was like, my French is excellent at this point, right? It should be great. And about 5 or 6 years later, I was singing Marguerite and Faust at Curtis. And one of the coaches from the Met was coaching us on our French language. And she tore me a new one. And I had to relearn how I was singing in French because it was so close to spoken French. I knew how to speak French. I could converse in it. I was totally fluent, but it was too close to spoken. And so I'd even learned how to sing largely in that way, but it was much higher in Coloratura days, so it was obviously going to be modified that high. With the lower role like Marguerite, I had to suddenly learn how to change my understanding of how to pronounce the French language so that it didn't match conversational French. And that was really tough.
Yeah, wow. You'd be trying to fight a whole bunch of muscle memory there.
Mm-hmm.
So that being fluent and having all that experience, you're like, God darn it. Gosh,
Right?
gosh darn it. Why? All this effort and now I have to redo it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness. That probably leads me to another question though that could be interesting for people listening to this conversation. When we're learning a new language and we're diving into IPA and we're learning about all these different pronunciation things, compared to English, the English pronunciation, and of course, me being Australian and you being American, there's already differences in what
Right?
our articulators are doing. But when you're going, let's say from English, on a conversation of articulation.
Perfect.
When you're going from English to French, what are some of the main differences? Like, what are your articulators, your tongue, and how you shape words in the back of your throat and with your jaw and with your lips? What are some major differences going from English to French?
The really, really big one for me is the nasal vowels that you have in French, like that. And again, that when you sing a nasal vowel versus speak a nasal vowel in French, spoken is always going to be more nasalized and sung is going to be less because it's sustained. And we tend to think that nasal coloration is ugly, quotation marks around that. I think it's very dependent on style. In opera, if you get very nasal with your French vowels, it's not considered pretty. So those would be like your those kinds of vowels. Anyone that has a vowel plus an in, that's crazy. Also, you just have to know in French immediately, like you're not going to pronounce half of the letters and your R's are going to be way different. Like the American R is awful when it comes to singing. It's so annoying. And then the way that the R changes in different English dialects is insane as well. So with French, another thing that's different between sung and spoken, though it depends on the school of music you're from. If you're singing really projected opera, you are very unlikely to do a uvular R, which is what you would do when you're speaking French. It's the R in the back of your throat. So you'll use more of a frontal instead of a essentially sound. So tip of the tongue instead of back of the tongue. Oh, yeah. It's a lot of like boop, boop, boop.
Yeah. I can imagine that you probably spent a fair bit of time on working on in a style that has a nasalized pronunciation and can sit really nasally and really in the back of the throat. Being able to free up your vowels enough to be able to still project over an orchestra. For those of you who perhaps aren't as familiar with the structure of classical singing, and of course I'm not going to be as experienced as Elizabeth on this, but a general understanding coming from a contemporary background to the classical background is the classical singing style is vowel dominant. So there's a lot of importance placed on the shape and the color of the vowel that you're producing. So what you just described, Elizabeth, is having to figure out how to produce a beautiful open vowel enough to project still and create some amazing dynamics, which we'll dive into later, be able to produce those dynamics while still dealing with things that are set up to be nasalized, which if you're not sure how things are nasalized, that means your soft palate wants to come down so that it can propagate up and out through the nose. So you're talking completely different propagation there.
Yes.
So, that sounds almost so like counterintuitive. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. And we'd say things like, oh, maybe like 10% nasality, like just that much, little tiny percentage, right? It's amazing.
Wow. Okay. So importance of training body and mind for professional performance. Let's put ourselves in that performance environment now. Do you have any rituals that you use to prepare for your performances when you're about to go out on stage? Because you've mentioned the mental, the psychological a few times now, and I thought we could dive on a little bit more into that.
Yeah, man, the psychological aspect of singing plays such a huge role. And I've never been somebody who wasn't nervous. There are a few, just a few people out there, I think, that really don't seem to get nervous. That's not me. I would say I'm much more on the spectrum of gets very nervous. And
Whoa,
so to deal with that, I heard a saying, which I think essentially was how I was already dealing with it at the time. But it was, my message is more important than my nerves. And so I always knew that when I went out on stage, it was because of that moment while singing Nuvoletta again. She climbed over the banisters. She gave a tiny cloudy cry. She was gone. When you go out there, if you're thinking about, I need to make everything perfect, this and this and this and this, it's really easy to go into a mental spiral, I think, and be worried or shocked if something doesn't go exactly how you wanted it to. But if your intention is instead, I'm going to communicate a message to my audience, and I want to have that emotional, the way that it was intertwining, I want that feeling to be there between us. If your focus is that, it takes you out of your own nerves. And I think that's a beautiful thing and a really great way to deal with nerves. But I also do all kinds of other things. Of course, getting a good night's sleep was tough. So night before a big performance.
Oh no.
So I was always really good about getting lots of exercise, just trying to take care of my body, and tried L-theanine to help me sleep at one point, or melatonin. So various things to try and at least get a good rest. Most of the time it was not ideal. But the day of the performance, I was pretty structured. I think more structured than some singers too. I would make sure I got a light workout in. I'd make sure I got a really nice steamy shower in, because I love steaming my vocal folds so much. And then right? Beautiful. Then I would do often a very specific meals that were kind of gentle on my stomach, usually a banana in there. Sometimes I do a tuna sandwich. I don't know why that really calmed me down. Or like a salad with some protein, just something that, definitely no coffee right before singing for me. Or no wine. And then I would go.
That's very different to contemporary. No alcohol. That's super different to contemporary.
Right?
I'm kidding. Continue.
No, these days, I can have, well, not right now because baby, but before, having a beer with me and doing a recording session, I'm just at home recording. If I'm getting worried about something, have a beer and I can make it a lot better. Kids, don't drink too much. Okay. But anyhow, that was not happening with the opera though. So I would usually get there early. I would warm up early and do a longer warm up before people were there. So I feel like I was more grounded, and sing through hard parts in the role for sure. And I would always do some form of SOVT exercise, though I didn't know at the time that it was necessarily SOVTs. That's semi-occluded vocal tracts. So I would usually do lip trills, a bunch, and some exercises, and then go through hard parts in the role. And then, one of the things that was really helpful when I got really nervous is I'd actually journal about different parts in the role and how the message of a particular aria or song, how it was true for me that day. So people change, and I feel like you're bringing a different truth to each performance. So if I was getting particularly nervous, I would just sit down and hone in on what I wanted my message to be at different points during the opera, and that really helped.
That's amazing. And I think that actually connects super well, and I'm sure you would agree with this, to the power of your intention when you are singing. So not just your lyrical connection, am I acting the words, but do I mean the words? What do I want them to mean for the people watching me? And emotion, sometimes when we speak about technique, we'll break down things that have a physiological or an anatomical correlation. And the emotion of it is somewhat left in this ambiguous little floaty area of you just feel it, you just do it. You find out what the word means and you just do it. So that already, you're talking about journaling, that to me is a process that someone watching this could take and cultivate as part of their development so that they can connect to their lyric and have those really meaningful performances. Because we can watch technicians who are really good at what they do, and they can hit every single note perfectly at the perfect time. And then there's performances where the people like yourself care so much about the message and how they connect with the people that are watching that it just adds something so beautiful to the experience. And I love that you've described this like reciprocal energy with the people that are watching. And I think that that's absolutely magical. And it hits on a point of technique that sometimes we look at it analytically as opposed to something that you cultivate, you develop, you work on this to be able to find out what it means to you, find out what it means to the audience, and how you can best lure the audience into that space with you.
Yeah, totally.
Join me, people.
The casting a spell.
Yes, it is. It's literally casting a spell. And I've watched some of your performances, and it truly does feel like casting a spell. And I'm just watching it on YouTube. So that's incredible that that's not only part of your technique and something you care about, but that's part of your process for preparing for the role, with the whole psychology of it. So is there anything else that you would say with nerves specifically, maybe not for you personally, but that you use with other students to help them when it comes to stage fright or nerves? Because it is a huge part of performance. I don't think I even know anyone who would say that they never get nervous, and everyone's process for dealing with that seems to be slightly different. So
Yeah,
there's
a couple things. One of the things that helped me a lot was to also break things down scientifically and approach voice scientifically, which came a little bit later, actually, where I really got into voice science a little bit after college. I had some pedagogy and some voice science in college, but I really nerded out later. So just understanding that it's not all mystical. You breathe, you phonate, and then you shape the sound. So knowing that there's a process and there are ways to help that process, let my logical brain come in and help counteract. And then also understanding that breathing really calms the vagus nerve and can help you just calm down. Finding ways to stabilize your breath and get your breath really low, even when you're nervous, and taking lots of breaths. I used to, even on the side of the stage, I still do this actually, I shouldn't say used to. Often before recording or doing any sort of singing, I'll take a knee up and be standing up with one knee up, essentially balancing, because it helps me breathe lower, like into, like all the way down into those pelvic floor muscles. So if I can get my breath support that low and that hooked in, then I won't have as many problems with nerves or concerns. It'll just immediately calm me down. Definitely the lower stabilized breath, I think, is super important for students.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you've mentioned how important is getting that low connection, but also feeling that low connection, because it does seem mystical sometimes. You'll hear people speak like breathe from your diaphragm, which is a term that I could rant about all day.
Right.
But I'm not going to, because I'm interviewing you right now. But just how important and how you can break down those processes so that they are less mystical and anyone can find out for themselves how far they can take it. But yeah, that low breath, I guess I kind of want to segue from this low breath into one of the repertoire conditions of singing classical music. How on earth do you hold the notes for that long and for that loud? Let's dive into some technique, dynamics, and phrasing duration. Let's do it.
That's a good question. Well, you practice it a lot, right? You practice it a lot. It's interesting. it is often easier for me to hold a note that's loud than it is for me to hold a note that's soft. And that's because oftentimes softness is associated with more breathiness in it. And loud is more closure. So there's not as much air escaping. And then, of course, you have more breath pressure that's built up that's helping create that louder dynamic as well. So if I have a loud note, and if it's high, which means that less air can also get through. So if it's a loud, high note, holding it for a long time is kind of fun. It's like I've practiced this a lot. I can do it forever. That's right. And there's something delightful and gleeful about that power. So there's that reminds me in the Martinella art and the crazy competition one where I'm sweating tons on YouTube. There's a high C that started. It started kind of soft and then it grows. Starting it softly is so hard on a high C. But holding it and crescendoing through it actually helped to keep it longer than if I just had to try and be a little tiny, floating on it the whole time. That would be much more difficult for me, at least.
Yeah. I mean, if we're thinking about breaking that down into the physiology of that, your soft note has thinner fold closure. So that would make sense. The chance for air to come through when you're in a thin fold phonation is already really high. And then for volume, your amplitude is created from those vocal folds coming together at a greater rate of collision. And then above the vocal tract, I mean, we can dive into this for classical, but above the vocal tract is so important for producing those louder dynamics as well.
Oh, yeah.
So do you feel like it's not just about the vocal folds when you're starting off soft and getting louder? When you crescendo, do you get that almost secondary vibration feeling in your pharynx when you're singing as you're getting louder? So does this correlate to a physical feeling for you internally as you are crescendoing?
And I think that part of studying opera is becoming very familiar with all of the different feelings that you have along your face. So going from my nose, along my cheekbones, back by my eyes, everything there. When I first was studying opera, it wasn't as we didn't talk about the act of phonation as much. We talked a lot more about breathing and placement. So we almost kind of skipped over this step, which later went much more into, and I feel like that was one of the missing puzzle pieces for me at one point. But I can tell you from how it vibrates in my face, from the resonance in my face in different areas, how that note sounds out there. With opera in particular, you're trying to go for so much more resonance than you do in other styles.
Yeah.
And there's this singer's format where you're essentially accessing overtones in a very specific area that helps that voice project over an orchestra. Yeah. So it's interesting. Opera is one of, I think, the most difficult things for me still to coach online versus in person. Because online, if I'm working with somebody in a different style, they have a microphone, and that's not that unusual from how they'll be performing. With opera, you almost need to be in a room to hear, especially a large room, really helps you coach that person into getting the placement that's going to hit those extra overtones so that they project over everything else without a mic.
That's insane. Having to train format tuning over online because, wow, yeah, the sensory information alone from singing close to a microphone to singing out into a room, physiological and psychological, that's a lot to have to contest with. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Singer's formant, that is a term if you're not familiar with, which is that clustering of formants so that we can make the big noise.
The big noise, right?
Make it big.
I like online, I feel like if you hear that like brr, like there's this weird burr that happens essentially where you say, okay, they got all their overtones in there. Perfect.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you're not actually listening for them. You're listening to the interference with the technology.
Sometimes, yeah.
Well, at least you're listening for them. You're looking
Yes.
for clues so you can correctly support your students. When you started out, were things like formant tuning and developing stamina for being able to sustain, for being able to handle larger roles, how long did it take you? Because I feel like sometimes when they listen to singers, they're obviously listening to a singer at their, not their final form, but like their professional form. And so often this might generate an idea that you should be able to achieve these things quickly. And I think for classical, because there is, I guess, more acceptance of being able to have a very extensive career over many, many years. And so there's more time to develop as a young artist, say, compared to contemporary, where they're like your early 20s and then that's it. Or at least as a female. So in that environment, knowing that you can develop things over time, for people who maybe don't understand just how long these processes can take, were there parts of your technique that did take longer to develop? What kind of time are we looking at? And then frequency of practice that would relate to that time for you to be able to develop to the point where you have this stamina, because stamina doesn't happen overnight. And I think it'd be great for us to be able to talk about that with someone who is an opera singer, because you're in one of the most enduring performance environments and it all has to come from you physically. There's no amplification to help you, to assist. There's no emphasis.
No emphasis, no.
Not at all.
I think, just schooling wise, it's much more common for somebody studying opera to be in school and in young artist programs for a decade. So for me, just college, I was there for 8 years. That's normal. Like, that isn't even a lot. That was the majority. That was the bulk of my studying until I got my master's degree. And then I still, there were various young artist programs where you go to one opera company for a bit and study a role or something like that. And then in addition to that, you get to an opera company and you start doing roles. Often you'll start in smaller roles, or they'll I was in a really good position in Dresden where they helped nurture me into my first Violetta, for example, which is a role that has crazy stamina needs. And they gave me the coaching and they gave me the time and lots of practice. And I'd been working up for that role for years. We knew I would do it eventually, but they really gave me the time. But even when I got to that first performance, you don't expect how adrenaline's going to affect stamina. So, you end up realizing when you get to the third act of the opera that the voice is just functioning a little bit differently. When you've got the adrenaline, even after all of that practice, you might have sung it through 100 times before, but you'll get there and you go, okay, well, I guess I can float on this note more than I thought before. Or maybe you'll make a couple mistakes. Maybe there'll be a crack somewhere, For a young artist and a debut role, it's a scary time, and they're figuring out often how to have that endurance over the whole time. But for a lot of singers, what happens is they keep doing the same roles over and over and over. Okay. So I think oh my gosh, I can't even count the number of performances I did of Pamina. That was one of the roles I did a ton from the Magic Flute, and in all kinds of languages and versions and stuff. So you go to a company and you have a new production and you learn how they want to frame this particular opera. And if you've sung the role a million times before, it's not that difficult to do. If it was your first time, you would need a lot more time and preparation. But I think that having the continued ability to sing the same role in another company allows you to settle into that stamina element as well. And then, of course, with college and that training, you're working up. You're not singing a big role right away. You're doing small ones first. And you'll continue to do small ones at big houses until you often graduate into big ones at big houses.
Right. It sounds like a lot of dedication and time has gone into developing not just the instrument for your career, but then throughout your career as well. One of the other influences that I probably want to ask about is, over this long period of time, what has been your favorite roles? Who have been your favorite people to listen to, who have mentored you to kind of keep that development and that love going throughout, alongside obviously your own successes when you finally get something you've been working on for years, or you finally get an opportunity to perform something that you always wanted to? What else feeds into that?
Let's see, influences and supporters. Obviously, my mom, really, really huge. And my family is just extremely supportive overall. But I think that voice teachers are extremely important in that guide because the voice is so emotionally and psychologically attached to everything else. So I would really look at Marlene and Malice in New York really helped me a lot with that. And then Stephen King, he's a voice teacher, not just... There's an author that's Stephen King too, but Stephen King helped me dive into the science side. I even later on, I think Dr. Ingo Tietze became one of my big influences as I started diving into more vocal research and science about voice. But then just singers, I always have loved Pavarotti the most, I think, out of all classical singers, because of the way he's so generous with the sound, and Nessun Dorma gives me chills every single time. It's amazing. Often I would end up studying how certain singers would perform certain roles, which meant that sometimes I'd be studying Maria Callas doing a role, or sometimes Marilla Franey, or sometimes Lucia Pop. Oh man, her Pamina is great. Really, really, really great. So it would be very often when I went to roles and studied them, I would look, and this is common for opera singers, I would look a lot more, and I still do this. I'll go and look at all of the performances of other singers and say, I like that part. I don't like how they did that part. And then take that and help that form for me what I wanted my version of a role to be.
Okay. I feel like you've almost dived into practice theory there as well on what you surround yourself with to continue developing your own voice. It's not just listening to yourself and working with a teacher. You have to do your own you have to do your own submersion in what people sound like and what you like about how they sound, and what's, I suppose, also been successful for other people, and seeing if you can learn either what they've done or evolve it or something. So I feel like we've almost dived into a little bit of professional practice theory there, where you have to be doing that for yourself as well as a professional performer, so that you can not just be exposed to the people who are, I guess, are highly influential to you, but who are also considered to be some of the greats of your industry, so that you're aware of them and you can see what you can incorporate into your own style and make your own style. It's that's really amazing for you to speak to that process, because sometimes I feel like we don't really talk about role models in that way of, we actually utilize these role models for more than just, oh, I like how they sound. I like them.
Yes. I think it is important to pick and decide what you want to sound like.
Yeah, and formulate almost like, this is my sound and it's developing and it will continue to develop. That's really amazing. Voice is amazing. I love singers. So speaking about voice though, sometimes it's not so nice to us. We like to be nice to it, but it's not so nice to us. Let's talk about some vocal health and how we manage that, because Lordy knows that sometimes this does not want to play ball, and how do we work with that?
Yeah, well, I have one of the banes of my singer existence has always been allergies. And allergies are just awful for singers. And particularly seasonal allergies are very bad for me. So a grass allergy or a pollen allergy essentially can be very, very bad. And I ended up having vocal nodules develop on my vocal folds a few different times. One was seasonal, one was related to cats. And it made me become very aware of how fragile voice can be. When you're in your early 20s, I think a lot of singers, you can just get by. The body's kind of taking care of a lot of things. You haven't, gotten in trouble yet. But when you start to get closer to 30,
bulletproof.
right? Exactly. And then when you get to towards your 30s, you go, why is that not working? For some people, that's later or earlier, right? But for me, having nodules happen related to allergies was terrifying. I always thought that vocal nodules was like a death sentence for a singer, essentially. And it's not.
No,
it's not.
No, not at all. It's actually surprisingly one of the vocal pathologies that is sometimes the easiest to fix.
Yeah.
To recover from.
Yeah, it's not too bad to recover from.
Yeah. Which is, it's still scary though, because there's that psychological element, because you hear people talk all the time about, nodules, she can't sing anymore. And it's like, well, there are actually things that you can do now. For those who maybe aren't familiar with nodules, did you want to just describe what nodules are and sometimes how they form?
Yeah, so they're like, if you have your vocal folds coming together and going waka, 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 right? It's not fuzzy. It's your vocal folds, I swear. So along the edge of both vocal folds, you'll usually see bilateral nodules that form essentially, and often they'll be like on a particular third of the vocal fold too, but they're like almost like little points of impact happening a little too much, or if there's too much irritation in the vocal tract, that like the vocal tract is the vocal folds are a little more dry. Sometimes this will be more likely to form these like tiny calluses that look like two little bumps. But then what happens is, as those bumps get bigger, it's hard for the vocal folds to completely come together as efficiently. So with vocal nodules, often singers will start having air escapage that's very unintentional, or a lot of difficulties singing a high note, which especially when I was working in coloratura music, and often dramatic coloraturas actually, I think, are one of the most common types of voices to get vocal nodules as well. So not surprising at all that was happening. And it just makes it extremely difficult to sing a high note. Often you feel like you need more breath pressure. You have to kind of hawk at it, which actually can make the problem worse, right?
Oh gosh.
So for me, I had to very carefully monitor that, and would regularly get scoped, check on things. I had allergy medicine that I took to help reduce my allergies, and that helped a lot. And I started doing a lot more SOVT exercises as well, which really helped too. So it was kind of like a health front and singing efficiency front combined. And there were times when I had to do a performance, even though I knew I had some nodules coming up. So I'd rest a few days ahead of time, and they would give like a little, not steroids directly into the folds. I know that is risky, but some singers will do that. But they would give some steroids, not like pump you up steroids, but reduce inflammation steroids to help that nodule essentially go down a little bit before a performance. And then they would check you the week after and make sure everything was totally fine. That's sort of risky though. So that was a last minute or last resort.
Yeah. I do think it's important to note that if you're taking a steroid, if you are a singer, it is for reducing inflammation, but it is definitely a last resort. You kind of want to be able to figure out the root cause of whatever it is, or try to mitigate it in other ways before you go to medication, because the steroid doesn't get rid of the problem. And sometimes, even though the swelling has gone down, if suddenly you've gone into a heavy role and you've got lots of, I guess, to use your terms, heavy wacka 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 happening.
Yes, exactly.
Then you actually wind up exacerbating potentially the problem, and it can come back worse. I've given myself laryngitis before because I had a really long gig and I took prednisone because I was like, I have to do this.
Yep.
And then gave myself laryngitis afterwards because it was too much wacka wacka wacka.
Yeah. Like if you're going to do a steroid, it has to be very, very guided by your voice teacher, by your doctor. And then I feel like it's essential that you take time off after that performance.
Yeah. Yes. Don't expect those steroids to get you through a whole performance season if you're doing back-to-back shows. That's not what they're there for.
Nope.
But they can be helpful in a cinch. Last call, like the last option.
Precisely.
But yeah, it's so lovely to be able to talk about vocal health as well. Because I think just general vocal health could be helpful for people to know, on top of, obviously that's a specific scenario where you figured out that the correlation between your allergies and the development of nodules, like you'd connected those together so you could try to mitigate it. But outside of, I suppose, really specific situations that are perhaps more individual, what are other things vocal health wise that could be good to incorporate into your practice as a professional?
Oh man, one of the really big things is talking loudly at bars or restaurants. COVID has, reduced that work quite a bit, but I think that it's so hard as a professional singer to explain to your friends like that you really, really want to go out with them after the performance and celebrate with them. But if you do that the next day, your voice is going to be gone. So I think just being aware of how loudly you're talking over people in a loud atmosphere or at a concert. People are losing their voices at concerts all the time. Right? Yeah. And then when I think that more people need to know about singing on straws, I've had like lots of people, and it's VO. I've even taught some voiceover as well, and just like having a straw. I have this like set from singing straws that I love, and doing a little, essentially helping make it makes your vocal folds more efficient is the most simple way to explain it. If people can learn how to speak with more efficiency, so they don't need to push, they don't need to gasp for air as well. If we can find that efficiency in using a straw, if you're at a game conference and you're talking over everybody all day long, go to a bathroom somewhere and make some weird noises. Don't worry, it'll be fine. And reset your voice so that you're speaking with more efficiency instead of trying to drive things with extra loud air and gasps. That's really useful.
I definitely concur on the SOVTs. So using the straw to create that balance of pressure on the inside of the mouth, because your air can't escape as quickly. So it has to figure out how to balance itself out. While you're still making sound, you're still expected to produce something at the vocal fold level, and it has to make it through this teeny tiny little straw. So you wind up with back pressure. And I think it's a great way of winding yourself down. And yes, more straws.
More
You're doing
straws.
the Lord's work.
Right. Can we just have everybody that even speaks, not just singers, can we just all use straws a lot more and take care of our voices?
Yes, please do. I think that is an excellent tip. Everybody, get your straws. It's National Buy a Straw Day.
Buy a straw day. I like that. Perfect.
I mean, it'd probably make our jobs easier when you're working with students because they'd have it handy straight away. Yeah. Actually, funnily, as an aside, I used to, you know how, I suppose, I don't know what it's been like in America, but here we've had an overhaul of plastic straws. So it used to be that you could just run down the road and grab a straw from anywhere. And now you can't get plastic straws anywhere. So I'm like, gosh darn it. Okay, save the turtles, but now I'm inconvenienced.
I feel you on that. I used to go to different restaurants, and if I liked the diameter of a particular straw, I would just keep it. I was like, yes. That straw from Applebee's, that was a great straw, right? Keep that one around. And then, now I just have the metal. I still have a few straws, but I'll keep them in a pencil holder if they're plastic. And, so it keeps them cleaner, or I'll keep them in a plastic bag. And that way going through them is a lot slower, but you have to order them. You can't just go to your local Starbucks. Well, you can in Arizona still, but in many places you can't.
Okay. I mean, there are places that have plastic straws, but it's just not the same. It's not the same level of resistance, and it's not as stable. I can't believe we're breaking down the
things we love about straws. But we get very picky. Singers get very picky about straws eventually.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
yeah, it's a thing.
It is. It's a very important tool. All right. So I'm going to move past the straws now, I promise. So aside from not talking over loud environments, of course, you want to develop that physical awareness of how things feel as a vocalist so that you notice when something changes or doesn't feel right. You can pick up on that change and go to your singing teacher or having a mentor or a medical professional who you can go to. I mean, you can kind of cultivate your own little singing team of teacher, doctor, and like your ENT or your specialist.
Yeah,
so
totally.
that you can go to them and they know your history, and if you have a problem, you have someone to go to who can assist. Aside from that, and like not talking in loud environments, like absolutely the over talking in loud environments. I'm so glad that was the first thing you mentioned.
Yes.
Because it's true. Sometimes you won't lose your voice from the role. You'll lose your voice at the after party.
Yep.
That's where it goes. And then, of course, when you don't want to talk, people are like, "Oh, such a prima donna, such a diva."
Why is it that important? Right?
No.
It's like, no. But really, I want to perform tomorrow night.
Yeah. I have a job to do. And this is part of it, me looking after my voice. Okay. So we've dived into some training things. Now, you mentioned earlier, and I kind of want to connect those two together. You mentioned earlier being a dramatic coloratura. Can we break down what it is that a coloratura has to do? Because it's specific technique-wise on the things you need to cultivate, and it can lead to some pretty impressive runs vocally, not the other kind. Haha, I'm so funny.
Amazing.
Anyway, let's talk coloratura. What does it mean? What do you have to do to be able to move your voice that quickly?
So coloratura is often going to be associated with tons of runs, a lot of agility in the voice, and often it's associated with the highest female voice type. Now, voice types change as you mature. Mine changed more than most people's. To the point where a lot of times today I'll sing something that's mezzo and be correctly suited for that, even though that meant that I went from coloratura, which is like often the highest, most agile. Dramatic means that I had a lot of power with it. So even though I sing some light or lyric coloratura things, those are like the French bird songs, by the way. It's kind of funny how many songs talk about birds in French lyric coloratura repertoire. But anyhow, the really high stuff, when you start to have a lot more power behind it and maybe some powers in the lows, you'll have more dramatic with that. Then we kind of come down as a person is progressing. At one point I was singing a lot more lyric repertoire, which is sort of like more just like beautiful, long, sustained lines. But I always had this dramatic edge in the voice. So at one point I went to a spinto soprano, which is considered a young dramatic soprano, not quite Brunhilde. But when I was singing kind of in that spinto, but still had some coloratura access in that area, that was when I would just die all the time. It's like the favorite role to write a death for, or favorite voice type to write a death for. Very expressive, very dramatic, can be very fragile, right? So Violetta is a great example of a role that sometimes is cast as a coloratura soprano because there's lots of high stuff, but sometimes cast more as a spinto because there's a lot of dramatic stuff, sometimes lyric because there's long lines. So she kind of covers the basis of like different, it's almost like it's training too. It's like quarterback versus running back, in football, there are different ways you can train your body for the same sport, if you will. And so you kind of go through all of those. And then eventually you can have singers that do coloratura that are lower voice, and we'll usually be referring to lots of runs at that point. It's a bit nuts. I feel like I missed something in there. How do you train for that? Was that?
Yeah. So I'll reframe my question, because I feel like that was a great description of not just what a coloratura has to do, but insight into just how specific the Fach system can get.
Oh yeah.
Where your voice type and the repertoire that you can sing, like physically capable of singing, but what is written specifically for your voice type. I think that was awesome. Just being able to dive in there onto like a little window of the Fach system, because I only understand it as sort of you break down into your soprano and you have your lyrical or your dramatic, and then your mezzos and your altos, and all the way down, of course, into your little basso profundo at the bottom. But learning about the spinto soprano, so that's the younger soprano who's developing their ability to be dramatic and fast.
Especially dramatic. Spinto, sometimes they'll even call it like a little pushed. So if you think about like Visidarte is a really good role, or Butterfly is a good example. Often it's somebody who's able to achieve powerful dramatic climax in the voice, but likely isn't going to sustain that for the whole opera. So you can have beautiful soft moments along with it. Whereas if you're singing a Wagnerian sort of dramatic soprano, you need to be able to like honk that out for hours and hours. It's very intense, very intense. So Spinto I still sing a lot of Spinto stuff. That's probably, if I were to go sing on a big stage today, I would probably be in a Spinto role, most likely.
Okay. That's really cool. Just knowing those differences. I think sometimes I feel like the classical world, that those insights that you don't really get them as naturally. So being able to speak with someone who has that experience, I find that really, really fascinating. That they're so specific about the different kinds of repertoire, but also how it relates just then, as you mentioned, I guess being able to perform now, but also where you're at in your development, how important repertoire is to, I guess, connecting back to vocal health. Yeah. So that your voice is appropriate, so that you as a singer can be able to actually, either honk it out for hours, or whether you're even capable of doing that. That's so specific and incredible that that's an element of other things you need to navigate as a professional. I think that's really, really cool. Especially coming from a contemporary background where it's like you just sing all whatever it is that you do. It's not that we don't have as much structure there to guide us on our development journey either. So that's really cool to get that insight.
I like that it's very focused on what is your best thing. What do you do the best, essentially, and maybe what's hardest. So let's feature the best stuff as much as possible.
Yeah, that's amazing. Oh, fun. Okay, back to one of the questions that I had earlier that I kind of rambled over, so now we're circling back. Coloratura singers have to sing very quick runs, have to move their voices in an agile pattern, so speed from note to note, but not just note to note, being able to have them clear and expressive with dynamics and intention. What are your favorite agility exercises? Did you mostly learn speed through repertoire, or were there separate exercises that you started with to start to cultivate that agility within your technique?
Yeah, I started agility exercises extremely young. I think that I attribute that mostly to Bach and singing in choir at Bach festivals. Thank you, Bach. He has very hard melismas, which is like a string of runs that you put together. Yeah. So I started that early, and partly because I had my mom and the piano background, I'd break up chunks of the runs. One of my favorite things to do is backwards chain a run. So most people end up practicing the start of the run and feeling like they got that part the best, and then it kind of falls apart towards the end. And I think it's much better to start at the end of the run, maybe catch the last 4 notes, then add another 4. So you've got 8, and then you have another 4. You're doing the last 12 then. And so you're taking it from the end. So what happens is you've practiced the end the most by the time you get to it, and it becomes more confident as you go through the run. I also really like switching up the tempo, not the tempo, it's the note length. So instead of having steady runs, daga, 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 I'll go daga, 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 and then it's go daga, 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 daga. So I guess it's the 2 ways to explain it, where you're switching the rhythms up within it to try and then go back and be able to have more control over how steady it is.
Okay.
So.
Yeah,
It's a lot.
that's already amazing, because I feel like sometimes the most common advice you get for doing runs is you just slow it down and then you speed it up. But things like momentum, knowing where you're going, being able to finish it at the end, that's incredible advice. So for anyone watching this who's interested in developing their runs, Elizabeth's just dropped some real like high level tips on developing your melismas and runs just there. So that's for free. You take it.
There's a ton of ways you can work on them, but I agree that the slowing down and speeding up is probably a good spot to start.
Yeah.
But maybe backwards chain that first.
Okay, that's amazing. So we've spoken a little bit about your influences, your vocal health, what you've needed to do to cultivate your voice along your journey, technique awareness from it just being breath and placement into awareness of sensation and feeling and connecting that to science and an understanding of the physiology of how all that works. Really powerful stuff as a performer to have that knowledge and awareness at hand. And of course, you share that experience now with people all over the world through your YouTube channel. So we've done about everything a professional could possibly do along the way there. And now we're sharing that with people. So how did we wind up starting our YouTube channel and now diving into genres that are outside of opera?
There's a lot in here I'm going to unpack. Let's see. So the main reason I started the YouTube channel was because I wanted to spread more vocal education. I became aware as I was working in video game music, actually, that a lot of composers didn't have the knowledge of how voices function. And I was working with a lot of new composers throughout opera, and then started with some in video games as well. And I went, okay, please don't write me an E vowel on a high C. That's a really, really bad idea. And they're going, why? And I'm like, oh, you don't know. Okay, let's bring some vocal education in here. And so I think the very first educational video that I put on the YouTube channel was essentially about how to write for voice. And specifically, I was using the channel to help, I think, with auditions at times, but that's not like that wasn't the YouTube channel and using that for the outreach that I wanted to eventually get to. Now, kind of along the way while singing opera, I had found that I wasn't satisfied with the reach of opera. I felt like it was a little bit confined at times, that I wanted to essentially reach more people with it. And I didn't like that it was so niche, even though I totally love it. And I think it's good to have niche things. I just wanted it to be breaking further away from the nicheness. And I also was really fascinated by new technology. So I started looking at composing for video games and writing music for that while I was on stage. It also helped me to rest my voice and have something musical and creative to do instead of just singing all day long and then not having a voice left the next day. So I started getting into video game music and writing for video games not too long after I had graduated just from opera. I think it was about 2 or 3 years later, and I started doing some online schooling for that, and then immediately was dropped into something called a game jam, where you develop a video game in one weekend, and somebody writes music and creates sound for it, and VO, and all the above. So I had sort of a crash course. Then became fascinated by the technology in video games and how that pushes forward technology around the world, how it was having composition that was not just linear and going from one time to another, but became essentially more vertical and was very moldable and adaptable depending on where you were going within the game. So I became very excited about that and wanted to influence that more, which is, I think, then why that you ended up having this how to write for voice for some composers. And then I started going further in the YouTube route, and I started writing more educational things like, what does water do to your vocal folds? Why is it important? Or,
yes.
Why do people think that only fat people can sing opera? Things like this. I know, right? That's sort of like dispelling a lot of myths.
Yeah.
And I was sort of in this weird area where I was looking for something and how to reach more people. I wasn't sure if that would be through doing games or at one point becoming the voice for an AI company, which, by the way, I used IPA to train a computer how to understand people. That IPA came back in technology for a voice assistant. Wow. It was so cool.
That is amazing. Right. You IPA'd an AI?
Yes, I did. It was really fun. So I was thinking, well, how do I use this voice? How do we take that and take this knowledge and reach more people with it? And ultimately, it was, I met somebody at a game sound conference. Sean Daniels is his name. And really amazing video game composer, Marty O'Donnell, introduced us, by the way. Marty is one of the most amazing composers with the Halo theme. And I was just like, oh my gosh, thank you so much, Marty. And then Sean is a YouTuber, and he told me what a thumbnail was. I didn't know. And I think this is like back in 2019. And so I'd been doing things on YouTube kind of sporadically for 5 years. So bad. So anyhow, I learned what a thumbnail was. And he went over my content and he said, look, it's really good. You've got good information, but if you format it in a little different way, maybe it'll help with this. And a few people around me, including Kirk, had mentioned maybe doing reaction videos. I was not sure because I felt like they weren't necessarily educational. And then at a conference at NAMM, which is another music conference, I was with some other YouTubers there with Sean as well. And they said, well, why don't you take this and make it your style? Don't just do a reaction video, but tell us why these things are cool. And we were talking about the fifth element, comparing them. And I said, like, take the sheet music and look at why it's hard, what they're doing, and how one person has chosen to do it differently in their style. So that all of a sudden, when I did that fifth element video, which was a combination of reaction, but analysis and education on voice, that started to take off. And then I started down the reaction/analysis videos on YouTube, really talking about what makes a singer great or why something they're doing is so impressive and maybe how you can try it too. That became the sweet spot because then I could reach people in a way that they wanted to be reached and also tell them a little bit about some of the things they experience every day.
Yeah, that is amazing how you've gone from video games to a conference to starting the YouTube channel to finding what has basically become, I guess, the essence of what you deliver on your channel is it's not just an ooh-ah, oh, that was great reaction. It's a ooh-ah, that was great, and this is why.
Yes!
And this is why they're incredible. And I guess, suppose fostering a love in people who perhaps didn't realize they wanted to know how it worked either because they're used to the traditional reaction format. And now they're like, oh, I'm actually learning things. This is really cool. Oh, I didn't know about that. And one of the other things that I'm going to go on a little bit of fan rant here. One of the other things I really love about your channel is how you draw in other areas of your experience, like with your composition experience and with your background looking at technology and being able to make your own recordings, and your understanding of those areas winds up feeding into this wonderful little cocktail of vocal knowledge and musical knowledge and experience as a performer and an understanding of technology and processes. And it can come out in anything that you react to. So it's a great balance, and clearly it's doing really, really well. People are absolutely loving your content. So, and I do think it fills a gap in, I suppose, the reaction community. I mean, I do a similar style of like almost reaction analysis.
But super vocal nerd. We're just vocal nerds together. It's like, it's so precious.
Mostly vocal nerdery, which is how we actually connected. We just sent a little email going, I love your stuff, fellow
I love your
nerd.
stuff too.
I feel a kindred spirit here. But I do think that being able to share, I suppose, the more niche things that people might not know, they want to know how vocal folds work, and presenting it in a way that people can learn about those things. I think that's really special, and I think it's incredible that you've been able to get your education to so many people in such a lovable format.
I know.
Truly, yeah.
It's a wonderful way to be able to pass along vocal knowledge.
Yeah. And
I loved the sort of space while I was still singing opera, but was also, writing for video games and producing music. That time was so important, where I learned the technology, and I had to, I think, just work a lot for about 5 years in there. It was a ton of work in different areas, bringing that breadth into things, learning how to use modern technology, learning how to do MIDI orchestration, like things like that, or how do you even produce a song? How, like, record, editing, mixing, mastering, those things were totally foreign to me coming from a classical background. And it was so crucial to have that, I think, so that now listening on the channel and still continuing to do those things today, I think it honed the craft even further to be able to pick things out that I hear in recordings that aren't just vocal, but are related to the production or composition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you also release your own music, your own arrangements of other music. Like I saw a pretty impressive unicorn costume.
Open your eyes, I see. Your eyes are open. Where no disguise for me. Come into the open. When it's cold outside, and I hear in vain, hold on to the light. There will be no shame.
So I suppose going from one of your favorite pieces, I forget the name, the piece that you maybe mentioned earlier, or perhaps I imagined that question in my head, from the classical world, your favorite performance from the classical world.
I talked about VC D'arte at one point, but that's one of the operas the arias I love the most. Yes.
So we've gone from that to an incredible unicorn costume on the internet that you arranged and produced yourself.
Yeah. There's kind of a combination of things here. So I'd been doing all vocal arrangements where I'm just using my own voice for all of the parts. And I started doing that when I was doing video game covers already. Okay. And I actually did a cover of Les Berceaux, which is a Fauré classical piece. And I took the piano part and turned it into a vocal thing at one point as well. That was the very first one I did, where I started using the voice as an instrument, not just a lead line with text to deliver. Okay. So I started doing that and then made my own arrangements for a group called Coloratura Collective and really built and released a lot of things through that. And then only in the last year have I started to say, okay, I would like to not do every single aspect of it at this point because I don't have the time for all of it and I'm going to delegate a little more. So I've been working with an arranger named Tom Anderson for the last 3 videos we've done. And also working with a man named Chris Vaughn, who I worked with on some of the albums for Coloratura Collective. He does mastering engineering. And so he's able to take over that aspect now because it was just too much. It's too much for one person to do and have a channel and teach and all the good things. And then we have a videographer as well. So basically, in order to up the production level, learning how to delegate those things over the last year was huge. But up until then, I was doing all of them, which made me really learn all of the steps. And I still am doing, all of the recording. Often I'll like switch or give directions on the arrangement or switch some things around, and then record that all, edit that all, mix that all, and then like leave that off and basically just be a CEO and say, yes, let's switch that, etc. Yep. The robot unicorn video was, that was the first time I handed an arrangement off, by the way. It was
How
really
was that
good.
process?
It was scary. It's so scary to like let go of some control and something that is so big. But it was great. And the shoes, they I had somebody help me put together the costume and suggest where you could go. Those shoes are actually stripper shoes.
I thought so.
I could hardly believe it. That's like from Pleasers, I think. But oh my gosh, that was such a good decision. That because they're huge heels, they're massive, but they look more like hoofs on a unicorn for sure, and they had really good balance on them. So, it was still terrifying being on top of this like rock thing that we had to climb up on, and then have the drone camera going around, being in those huge heels. But I can't imagine just doing it in normal stilettos. Like those shoes had to be those shoes.
Specifically the stripper shoes. Elizabeth wants stripper shoes, guys.
Guys, if you're going to do heels, stripper shoes are the way to go.
Amazing. Okay. I am going to talk a little bit about perhaps the more nerdy side of Elizabeth now. So we're going to dive into some questions relating to things that are less vocal nerdy and more just general nerdy. So you've mentioned video games a few times now, and I think it could be really cool if we could dive into just how far our interest in video games go and how far our love of the gaming and other aspects that may fall under the banner of nerdery. How far does this go?
This is a good question. So video game nerdery, I think it also depends on time. There are times when I have more time that I am just playing tons of video games. Let's see. Favorite video game to play, or I should say actually most played video game by far is Diablo 3. Cool. In fact, Mom and I even played that at one point together with barbarians that we called Barbies, and going hunting for loot we called shopping. So,
hey Dad, I'm going shopping with Mom.
Right? We're just like slaying things on Diablo. Yes.
That's amazing. And I know that you're a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh yeah. I like Dungeons and Dragons. I love the roleplay aspect of it. I love in the Bard campaign that we were doing, I loved getting the kalimba so I could write songs. I was composing songs in the kalimba to go along with my Bard. So it was just so fun.
Because you're not just a vocalist, you're not just a composer and a music producer and an arranger. You also play the kalimba.
I play the kalimba.
Piano. You play the
kalimba. Yeah, it's kind of amazing. I really liked it. It was fun to pick up.
That sounds incredible. And I also saw, I had a little sticky beak further along our document there, that there is some dancing involved in the skill set of Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Incredible. You can do literally everything. Literally everything.
I really love social dancing so much. It is one of the things I have missed the most recently, swing dancing in particular. Often I would do competitions in swing dance too, which is kind of crazy. But I started dancing when I was 13 or 14, forced to by my sister, but I really liked it. So kept dancing, and I've danced all over the world. It's one of the things I would do when I'd go to a new city is find the swing dance scene and dance. And then that expanded to blues dancing, Balboa, did a little salsa and tango in there. I love partner dancing though. You get to feel the music and express the music in a different way with another person.
I love how much you love music. It's just, it's amazing. And I guess that question, what you just said then kind of sparked a little off the books question for me. Different kinds of communities. I've noticed that you've mentioned in a lot of your answers, you speak to communities that you've gotten in touch with, people that you've collaborated with. So what are the different kinds of communities that you have worked with, and how do they differ from the community studying classical singing in America to the community studying in Dresden and performing in Europe, and now working with YouTubers and collaborating with video game developers and other people who are from the composition world? How do these communities differ? How are they the same? And what role do those communities play in your continuing amazing development as a person, as a musician, as a creator?
That's a great question. I think that within the operatic world, communities often are built around a certain production that's being put together or a company. And that could be really amazing. You're 3 months somewhere often, or if it's a company that you're with for a whole year, that's a nice luxury. But you've all been displaced to come together and build an opera together. It's just, you put something together and you get to know your colleagues very well, very quickly, because you're spending all your time together. And it makes a special, intense friendship often bud. And then you go to the next place. And that can be actually pretty difficult, because sometimes it feels like your long-term friends aren't, you don't get to have them as much, because you maybe made a great relationship, but you missed their birthdays then, right? So swing dancing communities, I love. It's got a lot of diversity in it, and it has a lot of inclusion. So a person can be weird and quirky, and there's still so much respect. And, I find that people find their place in swing dancing communities in a really beautiful way. You'll have people that are like totally normal or just brilliant. Like, I know Bill Nye, the science guy, is one of the people in the Los Angeles swing dancing community, right? But I find that I really like swing dancing in particular, and some of the social dancing, because I feel it makes you have new respect for people that might be different from you. I love that. The most important community to me at this point, I think, or the one that I'm working the most on building actively, is just our Charismatic Voice community. That is huge, and that's a part of our statement, is to build a community of people who appreciate good singing and good music. Community is in that fundamental reason for why we exist. So I think the community is extremely important, and it's possible now to have really big global communities. And I also like that with YouTube, it's got the longevity. So I could wish somebody happy birthday this year and next year.
Yeah, that's really special. I think that you've created these ties all over the world, and also factoring into your journey of that feeling of you meet new people, you get to create new connections, and at the same time, there's a sense of displacement. And the communities that you foster, it's a lot easier to foster an online community, because you can just go like, oh, I like you, and then you can just take them with you on your phone. Yeah.
Oh, exactly.
Meet them on Discord. Speaking of communities, we do have some questions. Some super questions. Now, our first question is from Jeff Koftanoff. I hope I pronounced that right. Yeah, otherwise, let's just blame my Aussie accent if I haven't.
Oh, it's so beautiful, right? Like, say my name, Julia.
Elizabeth.
Amazing.
Probably doesn't sound right. Okay, so Jeff has asked, and this is actually a great question because I just realized now that I never fully expanded on it earlier. Since you have now been exposed to many different types of metal music, would you like to collaborate with some metal musicians and sing with them in a performance or recording?
Yes, is the answer. It's funny. I think a lot of people are thinking, oh, you should be in a metal band at this point. I get that question a bunch. And I'm not really interested in touring again. I very deliberately have taken steps to change my reach in a different way. I could have kept on singing opera and gone on tour and gone back to Europe. That was a very clear path at one point. I decided I wanted to shift. And I like being more grounded. And hey, I've got a baby that's going to pop out soon. So anyhow, but absolutely, I'd be very interested in collaborating. In fact, recently did a collaboration with Devin Townsend, just did some backing vocals for one of his albums, and he's so amazing. I love him. I would be really interested in doing a collaboration with someone that does harsh metal vocals too, so that there is kind of an epic feeling. I think about like the first time I heard Tatiana and Ginger, and she had those crazy monster growls that it was just terrifying.
Yeah, scared the absolute bejesus out of me.
Right? Right?
Ooh, was not expecting that.
But I've gotten into the science behind it and understood what's being done, and I have so much respect for it now. I wonder if there might be a way to combine some crazy dramatic opera with this crazy dramatic, intense, harsh vocalization somewhere. I think that'd be very interesting. Or I also think it'd be fun to do something that was almost like the 10101 thing that Mike Mills does in one of Aryan's Arion pieces, anyhow, where he's like layering a ton of things within a rock opera format. So yes is the answer.
Awesome. Well, I certainly would like to see that. The opera harsh vocals combo sounds absolutely amazing. I would love to hear that. I think that would be really, really, really cool. Our next question is from Quirky Uncle Dave, and his question is, have you always had the desire to be an educator and communicator in addition to being a singer, or did that develop over time? Was there any particular individual moments or experiences that helped spark that interest?
Always wanted to be a communicator, even though I think I'm fundamentally introverted and I tend to gather my energy and then kind of go burst on stage, essentially. I've always wanted to communicate with people and have that message and back and forth. The education aspect, I really think it's coming from my parents. My dad was also a middle school teacher, and he would talk about teaching philosophy and ideas. And then my mom was teaching music as well. So I think that just happened very naturally without me necessarily being intentional about it. A lot of times people would tell me like, oh, maybe you shouldn't do this or this or this or this, or I never let boundaries hold me back. I would intentionally go after something. The educational aspect wasn't something I really intentionally went after. It just developed very naturally. And then I said, hey, I'm going to structure this more to reach more people with great knowledge.
Yeah. That sounds like a very natural trajectory considering your curiosity and your thirst for knowledge.
Yes,
and
I love
how
knowledge.
avidly you love learning and combining those things. I think that's actually so valuable. Because often people who are from intense performance backgrounds, they sometimes don't have the pedagogy side, or they haven't pursued the pedagogy side. And so there can be, I don't want to say the word holes, but the balance of you being able to connect your professional experience with your understanding of the pedagogy side. I think that's so valuable within the education community. That's just as an aside on top of that question. I truly believe that as a pedagogue, that's really, really valuable. And
much appreciated.
You're going to get a better, well-rounded experience from that kind of educator. So Runa says, you grew up in rural Washington, but have lived all over the world. What was your first big culture shock after you moved away from home?
That was France. That was right after high school when I went and lived with a French family.
Yeah.
There was a very big culture shock. Look, one of the biggest ones was I think the French were a lot more open talking about sexuality than I was. Okay. And to the point where I was shocked when some of the boys asked me, like, how do you tend your lady parts, essentially?
Whoa.
I know.
That's a personal question.
I was like, and this was at a French high school. I thought, is this just me? I feel like that was kind of over the line too, but I don't think that an American guy would have dared to say that. But that made me, one of the really big culture shocks was going to France and seeing that it was possible to discuss things that were more sexual in nature, and it wasn't as frowned upon. And in the States, you could see something of a more violent nature and talk about that more.
Wow.
And so with ratings and movie systems, like, it was much more acceptable for people or children in the States to watch violence than sex. And it was the exact opposite in Europe. That really blew little Elizabeth's mind. I was just like, oh, okay, maybe that was still over the line, the question from the boys, but this is indicative. And as I went along in high school at the French high school and conservatory at the same time, I became more familiar that there were just certain things that were not how I had grown up, but were totally acceptable.
Yeah, that would be quite a culture shock because you would have been fairly young So
Yeah, I was
it's not like a
18.
well-traveled Elizabeth has been asked this question. It's
No.
fresh out of high school, Elizabeth.
Out of high school, and had been in church all through high school as well. I'm very, again, Southern Baptist grandfather. So it was very shocking.
And we adjusted quickly.
It took some time. I won't say it was really quick. It was more like, oh my goodness, this is very shocking several times.
Wow. I mean, I suppose that's to be expected, because the first time it happened, you're probably like, did that just happen? And then you have to, is this normal? Am I the weird one?
Yeah.
Okay. That was a really cool question. I got more from that question. Learn a lot more from that question there. Okay. Robert K asks, do you feel torn between what your followers want you to do and what you'd like to do?
Oh, sometimes, but often not very, I would say not very often, because I really want, especially with recommendations on the channel is kind of the main thing I'm applying this to in my brain right now. I have a lot of recommendations that will go into metal and harsh music and rock vocals there. It's great. They help essentially teach me about things that I don't know about. So I love looking at what people are recommending there, and they steer me down this path that I never would have gone on my own. It's amazing. It's definitely a two-way street. And then I think because I'm also okay just choosing some of my songs sometimes and saying, hey guys, we're going to do opera today. I don't feel that I've become out of balance. I feel that I'm able to keep the variety of music that I want to have on the channel and learn and share both.
I think that open-mindedness is fantastic, because you do get those experiences that you might not have had ordinarily. And I mean, this is an aside question as well that I'm just putting on the end of Robert's question there, but coming from an opera background and now exploring so much metal on the channel, what parallels have you noticed, and how has your taste been changed? Do we view things we did in opera slightly differently now? Does the opera background change your perspective on, I mean, how you interpret metal initially and now your understanding of metal?
Yeah, I think the classical background, listening to metal is a big, is a sort of a paradigm shift for me, because I thought that metal didn't necessarily have the same virtuosic level. And I have just as much respect for metal musicians as I do for classical musicians. I think I had some sort of unintentional elitism that was in my subconscious, and I don't have that at all anymore. I hope. Same thing for the instrumentalists and the vocalists in metal. It's just really, really incredible musicians. And I find that in other genres as well, too. I think that exists, but I do think that metal in particular, and some rock too, like especially progressive, it focuses on that pushing the boundaries in the way that classical music has pushed boundaries too. And it focuses on virtuosity at that higher level. It's very, very impressive. So, but honestly, as long as somebody is communicating a strong message, I don't care what genre, like it just move me essentially. And then whatever the genre is, like, I'm really happy to dive into it and try and understand why it is they moved me.
That's a great process. Like, do I feel something? Yes. Okay, why?
Yes, exactly.
That make me feel something. Okay. That's great. Okay, moving on to Bart's question. They have asked, you are familiar with a lot of different singing styles, but is there any particular singing style you would still like to learn for yourself?
Ooh, that's really fun. Well, I'll just say the one that I currently, it's not necessarily singing, but the one that I would like to just dive into a lot more personally is more beatboxing. I started doing beatboxing lessons with Lane Stein last year. And he's the beatboxer from Voice Play. I loved their work. Started talking with Lane. Asked him if he could recommend a beatboxing instructor. And Lane was like, yeah, sure, I'll do it. I was like, oh my gosh. I was so nervous our first lesson. So we've done that off and on. Pregnancy definitely slowed things down for a while, as it does. It's like, whoa, I
You are
feel really
growing a
sick.
human.
Yeah. So, but that being said, beatboxing is really cool and really fun, and I want to develop it way more.
That's really, really cool. I'm sure with all the metal that you've been listening to as well, that interest in harsh vocals, that curiosity has been piqued for looking into that as well. And
yeah. And actually combining that with beatboxing is really interesting. So if I do a kick that's just like that kind of sound where you're trying to imitate a kick drum, if you do something that is including the false vocal cords with it and you go, oh, that wasn't very good. One that gets a little bit lower at the same time, it ends up being almost like a particular kick in a different genre of music. So
yeah,
I've been able to
supposed to sound a little bit more
take
like an
ideas.
808 almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
Exactly.
that bass sound that you could get in there. That's amazing.
It's fun.
Really cool. Really, really cool. All right, we have another question. This is from Miles. Can you give me your opinions on cooling or herding calls? Scandinavians often use this to call livestock down from high mountain pastures. It's known for its beautiful haunting tone.
Man, I'm not as familiar with that. I have heard it a little bit. I might be thinking of the wrong thing, but I think that it's essentially like a very staying in a lower register, almost like belting, but belting for a longer period of time to create a sound that elongates more. But honestly, it's not something that I've taken a deep dive into. I wish I could give a better answer to that right now, but I feel like I might be off track on it.
Okay.
You know what I'll do? I will promise on the podcast, I do asides where I talk about things later. If there's an idea or something in the interview that we haven't covered it in as much depth. So on the podcast version of this, I will go into depth on that. I will go look at it and give a better answer there.
And that is a great answer. We want that curiosity piqued. Well done.
Yes.
Miles, you've got Elizabeth on the herding call track.
Amazing.
All right. So we have another question here. I'm not sure how my Aussie pronunciation, we're just going to blame the Aussie pronunciation here. We'll go with this, but Arnout Nedderpelt has a question. Besides doing great vocal analysis yourself, as an opera singer, you've also had the privilege to have other reaction channels analyze and receive feedback on your own performances. How did it feel to be on the other side, and does it help you make better videos or to be a better interviewer?
It feels awkward to be on the other side, I will say, but also really gratifying sometimes. It's exciting. It's exciting when another channel does an analysis or reaction to it, and maybe they're introduced to opera for the first time through me, which was what happened with the Tribals channel. It was exciting to see them and like realize that, hey, this is your first opera experience. Whoa, crazy. How does it affect my videos and where we're going? I think I'm consistently pretty aware of other reactors and what they're doing. So I don't know that watching them necessarily do one of my videos has as much effect. But because I've been very intentional all along about watching other channels and picking out the things that I like and the things I don't like and noticing that, it's been a very consistent thing. Like Julia's channel, I say, okay, she knows really good voice sides and she relates really good voice sides. It's just, to me, Julia is able to give so much additional knowledge beyond just what's happening. And I love how nerdy she gets about it. So it's one of the things that I love about Julia's channel the most, and have definitely tried to keep a very active part of mine.
Which of course led to us being able to nerd out together.
Yes.
Which is really fun.
Yes. She understands me. Okay.
It is really, really fun. We promise. It's super, super fun. Just piggybacking off the feedback question, that almost sparked a question of my own. In the, I guess, more traditional training environments, like going to a conservatory, like going to a university, you often receive critical feedback in person, sometimes from people that you respect, like you mentioned earlier, where someone tore your friendship apart. I feel like so many performers have a moment where someone just ripped into them and tore them apart. How do you compare the kinds of feedback experiences that you get fairly consistently throughout the training phase, the cultivating your technique phase, working with people in workshops or singing teachers or professionals who come in to listen to you at competitions? How does it compare getting feedback in those environments to the feedback that you see in the people who are reacting to you? Is it, do you view them in different lenses? How does it make you feel on a personal level?
Yeah. Well, first things first, I think it's very important when you're a professional singer that you establish who you're going to accept feedback from. And I think that in a lot of ways that applies to YouTube as well, because lots of people have opinions about what you should do. You need to decide which opinions you're going to really let in. You have to kind of sort of develop a little bit of a tough skin while still being willing to listen, is the way I would put it. So usually there'd be around 5 to 10 people that, and really you want to establish like a core set of 5, I think, as an opera singer. That includes your voice teacher, maybe a primary coach, conductor. And you allow those people to really help form and shape you. But there will be all kinds of reviewers that come and they don't know your voice. They don't know what that you've been asked to do in this particular production. I had one reviewer say in an article when I performed in Bordeaux that it seemed like she was out of breath. But literally my direction from the stage director was to sing it like I was out of breath. So he presented it as a criticism. And I realized with that, and with also, honestly, some YouTube comments as well, I think you need to just not necessarily let all of the criticism get to you. You need to pick who you'll accept criticism from and make it people that will criticize you so that they can give you guidance and continue to grow and be better. I think we went off track a little bit on your question, but I think it's really hard in college with so many people criticizing young ones. You need to have people that are also saying things in a really positive way and saying, keep the good stuff. Here's some stuff to work on at the same time.
I definitely feel like that's super valuable advice. And I can see how it would apply to both areas. And especially with feedback on YouTube, in the case of people reacting to you, I imagine you're viewing them from not necessarily as specialized a background as the people who would have been giving you feedback in the classical world. Because as you mentioned earlier, your mindset and your training, it's very niche in its training as well, its training environment. And so cultivating your responses there. And I think it's kind of cool how you've been able to take that like psychological training from that environment and now apply it into the YouTube environment as well. Because it is so true. Everything you put on the internet is open to so many people for commentary and opinion. And whether it's someone reacting to your performance or whether it's someone watching your own reaction video and putting a comment underneath, learning how to navigate feedback, that's really good advice. You're good.
It's super important to listen to the community, especially I think it's important to ask them for feedback as well, because sometimes that team of people, you need feedback from your whole community instead. And so that's why I'm often asking questions in videos and asking people to write things in comments or in our community tab in YouTube saying like, what do you guys think about this? Because I'm really seeking feedback at that point. So it's also, I guess there's multiple levels to it.
I do think that's just part of your professionalism as well, though. It's not that if someone writes something that is critical, like you having been in that area, guys, on YouTube, I can guarantee you that Elizabeth has received critiques and feedback from people within the classical world that you have to learn to take on that criticism to further develop your instrument and to get further along your career. You're not going to be the best all the time at absolutely everything. That critical feedback is so helpful and useful. So I 100,000,000% believe you because I'm really bad at math. Although I heard you're really good at math. I 1,000,000% believe you when you say that you value that feedback and from your community. So I definitely believe that you would take everything and measure it for its quality and how it can contribute to your growth. Listening. Yes. And that is a sign of Elizabeth's professionalism. as
Thank
well.
you.
If someone goes, I don't like what you said, therefore I'm going to ignore it completely, they're going to miss out on potentially growing.
I guess I just realized like one of the best ways to describe it is listen, but you don't have to react to that. Like how you react to it is optional. I think you do need to listen.
Yeah, that's really cool. I took us way off track there. Next question is from Kirby. At the beginning of your singing career, did you have any pre-show rituals that would help with performance anxiety? I mean, we kind of touched on a lot of that earlier. So
yeah, I'm just going to go back, Kirby. My message is more important than my nerves. That is such a foundational thing that I try to share with everyone else who has performance anxiety or nerves, because that helps. It helps so much, and it keeps you focused on what's important. Yeah.
I almost had a thought then that I suppose it's not as nice thinking of other singers in this way, but there are some people that can perform with a lot of ego. They just want to be the best. They want to show off. They want to be able to do those things. And I love how you draw back like your inspiration and your power for your performances. Like you do incredible things, and it's powered by your desire to connect with that audience and stay true to your message of what you're delivering. I think that's amazing. Moving on to a question from Danny Logan. Easy, simple, quick question. Do you feel guilty doing Tool reactions being married into the Tool army?
I never feel guilty doing a Tool reaction. I think it's very important that I listen to my husband and every now and then choose a song that he particularly would like. So, it's essential.
Yes, I imagine we'd have a rather grumpy Kirk if he went, no Tool. I'm not reacting to any Tool. He'd be like, but why? They're amazing.
Right, exactly. That wouldn't fly.
And they are. And they are amazing.
They are.
He's right.
Yeah. No, they're amazing. I'm really glad he introduced me to them.
Okay. Well, I mean, he also kind of I'm not going to use the word bullied, but bullied me into doing my first Tool reaction as well. He's like, you have to. You don't understand. You have to.
Are you grateful though?
Oh God, so grateful. They're amazing.
They're
the
amazing.
Musicianship, the connection. I love it. We have our final Patreon question here. So we have Digiberta. I probably made that sound real weird.
No, that's correct.
Oh, it is Digiberta.
Uh-huh.
It sounds like something like an Aussie slang, connecting words together. Like, oh, did you say it? Digiberta.
Amazing.
Because we use didja all the time. Did you do this? Did you see that? Sorry, tangent. Apologies. I'm the wild card here, guys.
It's perfect.
Have you ever thought of being the lead singer in a band? And a corollary, if I may, what kind of band would it be?
Oh, well, let's see. I did sing with a jazz band for a little bit when I was in France. That was kind of interesting. Did more things in Paris.
Really?
Yeah, I know. I was pretty young at that point, and I was not used to smoky environments. Right? I'm sure you feel that. But yeah, I've thought about being a lead singer in a band, and I think that I just decided to make my own band up by making all of these a cappella arrangements and play all of the parts at the same time. So maybe that's what it would be. And I sing in a trio at one point for a few years in high school too. That was really fun. So I've sung in groups and bands and stuff. But if I were to do something today, I think I wouldn't want to tour. I think that's kind of the main thing. I'm just not, I did that for so long, and that's not my goal now. So.
And you have your family is growing.
Yeah.
And that's amazing. So I do think that touring and babies.
Right. I picked the right time.
I'm sure you could bring them along.
Right. They can be extra loud vocals, backup vocals.
Yes, they can. Guys, we have this amazing scream for the background. Excellent twang. Do you hear those harmonics?
Right. How does it get so much power?
You can hear it all the way at the back.
Right. Wow.
That's amazing. Okay, I probably only had one last question. Is there anything else that you would love to share with your community, either on your experience as an opera singer, an educator, a highly educated person having attended many prestigious places of music education and technology education for your skills as a producer working with different music technologies, and now as a YouTuber who's fostering a very genuine, authentic connection with her community and who genuinely cares about music education? Is there anything else that you just want to say or share with your community?
So wide open.
I know. I didn't help with that at all.
We've covered so much, but I think I just want to share that I find it so valuable to be able to continue to get to know everybody in our community and be able to grow together. I find just the human beings growing together is something that's extraordinary and gorgeous. That happens in friendships, that happens in marriages, that happens in a community. And I feel extremely grateful that my life has evolved in a way where I'm able to grow together with, 850,000 people now in our YouTube community. That's
Whoa.
Incredible. We're expanding and continuing to add more and podcasts and everything. It's such a beautiful, beautiful life. And I feel very, very grateful to everybody that lets me be a part of their life.
Of course, what you had to say was so sweet and humble and magical. Okay, I had one other question, but I think it would derail us back to a previous point. So I'm probably going to leave that one. Thank you so much for letting me pick your brain about your experiences and getting to know my friend even more. It's amazing.
Thank you. I really appreciate that you're willing to do this role switch. It's crazy and it's fun. So thank you.
It is really fun. It was almost like, do you want to interview me? It's like, of course I want to interview you.
I know. It's just so weird to ask.
I would love to.
So thank you.
Okay.
Really appreciate it. Cheers.
Okay. Oh, yes. We must cheers.
Cheers to you.
Cheers.